The problem with that is this war is completely out of control. I think that Iran has many more advantages over the United States. It has been a disaster. And even today, Trump has failed to articulate why the Americans are doing this, what the purpose is, and what the off-ramp is. What we're seeing day by day is pretty rapid escalation. Trump has failed to articulate purpose and a strategy for this war. At first, it was about nuclear uranium enrichment in Iran and the fear that Iran would develop a nuclear weapon. In fact, in Trump's State of the Union address, he said that he would never allow Iran to develop a nuclear weapon. And both chambers of Congress, both the Democrats and Republicans rose to cheer and applaud. It was really the first time that Congress demonstrated any unity during that speech. It was an extremely political speech. The Omani foreign minister, a few hours before the Americans and the Israelis struck Tehran, told us that the Iranians had already agreed to zero uranium enrichment, even for civilian purposes. So the idea that Trump needs to prevent a nuclear weapon, that doesn't hold. It's just a pretext. And they tried many different excuses. And then finally, Rubio said this. Rubio basically said, look, we had to attack because Israel was going to attack first. And then the Iranians would retaliate against both the Israelis and us. So to defend ourselves, we had to preempt Israel and attack first. Okay? So they're struggling for a narrative. They're struggling to explain to the American people why this is happening. They're also struggling to contain a fallout because after the Americans and Israelis struck the Iranians started to bombard U.S. bases in the GCC, and they closed off the Strait of Hormuz. And this is doing tremendous damage to the global economy. So oil right now, it's approaching $120 a barrel, $110 a barrel. I'm not quite sure, okay? But this is double from a week ago. And remember that the Strait of Hormuz delivers most of this oil to the Asian economies of Pakistan, India, China, South Korea, and Japan. Japan relies on 75% of its oil from the Strait of Hormuz. So in about 7-8 months, Prime Minister Takahashi has informed her cabinet that Japan will be out of oil. And Japan is, a manufacturing powerhouse. So this war has been a disaster. And even today, Trump has failed to articulate why the Americans are doing this, what the purpose is, and what the off-ramp is. And what we're seeing day by day is pretty rapid escalation. In fact, I think the second day or the third day into this war, there were rumors of ground troops. Yesterday, there's rumors that the 82nd Airborne Division of the American Army was given deployment orders, meaning it is possible Americans will choose to airdrop these soldiers into the middle of Iran. For what purpose, we don't know. There's talk of the Americans seizing Karg Island, which is the oil depot of Iran, and which accounts for 90% of Iranian oil exports. There's talk of the Americans funding proxies. There's talk of using tactical and nuclear weapons. There's talk of a national draft to find 500,000 soldiers for a ground invasion of Iran. So this war is completely out of control. And it's completely unclear what the Americans hope to accomplish with this war, right? So I think Iran is trying to fight a war of attrition, where it is putting pressure on the global economy, on the GCC nations, because Iran believes that the GCC nations, especially Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE, can apply pressure on Trump to end this war as quickly as possible. By closing off the Strait of Hormuz, Iran is trying to pressure the Southeast Asian economies of China, Japan, and South Korea to apply pressure on Trump to end this war as soon as possible. So the Iranians are fighting a war of attrition. Unfortunately, the Americans are fighting a war of destruction. So even though they haven't stated the purpose, it is clear from what is happening on the ground that the Americans and the Israelis are intent on complete and utter destruction of the Iranian government's capacity to deliver basic services to its people. What I mean by that is that they yesterday struck a desalination plant in Iran, so you're denying fresh water to the civilian population. That is a war crime. then the Americans struck oil facilities in Tehran. These are civilian oil facilities so that citizens in Tehran can drive their cars. And if you look at footage from Tehran, it is the apocalypse. There's acid rain. The entire sky is black, and these people have to breathe that air, so they will develop cancer. They'll have birth defects. It's almost like chemical warfare. So if you are just saying it's a war of attrition, that makes no sense. A war of attrition means when you embargo Iran economically. Why are you targeting civilians? You know, in the first of the war, Tomahawk missile hit a school in southern Iran and killed about 170 schoolgirls. This is an elementary school. 170 schoolgirls were killed in that. This war, the way it's being constructed, the way it's being fought, seems to me that the Americans are first and foremost focused on the destruction of Iran as opposed to regime change. So the Gulf states are the great vulnerability of the American empire because Israel, it has an eschatology. Unfortunately, religious zealots have taken over the state of Israel. So they're perfectly okay to die for what they believe in. And they can live in bomb shelters for years and years. That's how strong their faith is. And Israel was designed as an extremely resilient, extremely creative society. So Israel will emerge from this war intact and probably even stronger. But the Gulf states are different. The Gulf states are basically mirages. These 50 years ago, these were just deserts, right? And for most of human history, the Arabian Peninsula was not that inhabited because it didn't have access to fresh water. It didn't have much agricultural output, and so it cannot sustain a large population, and most were desert nomads engaged in trade. But Pax Americana changed all that because Pax Americana could needed oil to fund its empire, and it could offer protection to the Gulf states. So they developed really rapidly. So cities with maybe tens of thousands of people before now are in the millions. And one striking example is Dubai. You go to Dubai, it's just skyscraper after skyscraper. It is a very glitzy city, and it's trying to be the financial capital of the Middle East. And there are thousands of extremely wealthy individuals who've transferred their savings to Dubai because they believe that it's safe, it's comfortable, lots of good Michelin restaurants, lots of good five-star hotels, and I'm not taxed. But this image of Dubai as a financial hub is now shattered by this war, and they'll never recover from this. In fact, we're already hearing rumors of millionaires just fleeing with their wealth. Now they're going to Singapore, now they're going to Southeast Asia. A bigger problem is this. A bigger problem is that because the Strait of Hormuz is closed, their oil economies have collapsed. They can no longer sell their oil, and they shut down their oil production facilities. What people don't recognize is that the Strait of Hormuz takes GCC oil to Asia, but then it brings back food. The GCC imports 80 to 90% of its food supply. So the rumor is Dubai will run out of food in about a week's time. Then there's the issue of fresh water, where the greatest vulnerability is actually desalination plants. So the G nations, desalination plants provide about 60% of all their water needs. And so if these desalination plants are destroyed, then they run out of water in 1 or 2 weeks. And this means the entire destruction of the GCC. Now, I mean, destroying desalination plants will be the nuclear option for Iran, and so I don't think they would use it very lightly. But there's really no coming back from what's happening. I mean, for the longest time, the GCC had a reputation for being safe, for being extremely wealthy, and now that mirage, that illusion has been shattered. And once the illusion is shattered, you can't ever resurrect it again. So what Iran wants to do is basically kick the US out of the Middle East for a lot of reasons. And the main advantage is that once the US leaves, Iran will be able to control the Strait of Hormuz. Therefore, it will control trade access for the entire world. And that, and so the Gulf states will basically become client states of the Iranians rather than Americans. And that oil money now will be able to finance the rebuilding of Iran. So that's the end goal or the end game for the Iranians. The problem with empire is the hubris. And so another way of saying this is the empire would rather destroy the world than surrender its power, right? So the idea that the Americans will just leave the Middle East peacefully is just wishful thinking. Everyone's saying that, this war can only lead to the defeat of America. So America should just admit defeat right now and then go home and let Israel and Iran settle whatever problems that they have. Like the Middle East is not America's problem. But again, the problem is that America is addicted to the petrodollar. Leaving the Middle East would destroy the petrodollar. And if the petrodollar is destroyed, it would collapse the American economy as well. So America has $40 trillion in debt. And this debt is a Ponzi scheme. Like the American economy is sustained by a Ponzi scheme. And so the Gulf states, what they do is they sell their oil, get petrodollars, and then they recycle it back into the American economy, mainly by investing into AI, into data centers, which is now the main engine of growth for the American economy. So the Gulf states were to stop investing in America, the AI financial bubble would burst, and with it the entire American economy. America would suffer a much greater depression than the 1930s. That's how dire the situation is for America right now. So given my analysis of how the war is progressing, I think that Iran has many more advantages over the United States. The reality is that right now, it's a war of attrition between the United States and Iran. And the Iranians have been preparing 20 years for this conflict. In their eschatology, in their religion, this is a war against the great Satan. They've had many practice runs. Last June was a 12-day war when the Iranians were able to examine and analyze the strike capacities of both the Israelis and the Americans. And they've had a lot of time, 8 months, to prepare fully for this new attack. They, through their proxies, the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the militias, have been able to really grasp the American mentality. And now they have a pretty good strategy of how to weaken and ultimately destroy the American empire. So what the Iranians are doing is they're waging war against the entire global economy. And so they are striking the GCC countries. And not only are they striking GCC countries, American bases, they're going after the critical energy infrastructure of these bases. They blocked off the Strait of Hormuz. And eventually, they will go after the water desalination plants, which is the lifeblood of these nations because they don't have fresh water supply. In fact, the water desalination plants provides 60% of the water supply. So if a drone, and these drones cost $50,000, if they wiped out a desalination plant in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and it's a city of 10 million people, right? They'd be out of water in 2 weeks. And right now, the Iranians have de facto closed off the Strait of Hormuz, and the GCC gets 90% of its food from the Strait of Hormuz. So I know a lot of people are talking about the disruptions to the global economy, but right now, the Iranians are actually threatening the very existence of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar. And why this is important is that the Gulf states are really the linchpin of the American economy. So what they do is they sell petrodollars and then they recycle the petrodollars back into the American economy through the investments in the stock market. And right now we know that the entire American economy is propped up by investments in data centers. And a lot of that comes from the Gulf states. So if the Gulf states are no longer able to sell oil and they're no longer able to finance this AI bubble in the United States, then AI will burst, and with it will burst as well the entire American economy, which is really a financial Ponzi scheme. Right. So that's a dire situation that the Americans are facing right now.
You had in advance of this war on Iran, you had top military brass up to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff saying, this is a really bad idea. We are not ready for this. All the math on the interceptors that's been talked about for months at this point, and yet Trump still decided to go ahead. What is the calculus that he was making here that led him to take what already appears to be catastrophic actions? Right,
okay. So this is the key question. Why do they do this? I think there are three possibilities, okay? And I think all three possibilities are valid. The first is the idea of hubris. If you look at history, this is how empires behave. So the Mindoro kidnapping was quick, successful, and it was adrenaline rush for Trump. And that made him overconfident confident in the capacity of the American military, okay? So hubris is a factor, and we see this throughout history. Why did Hitler invade Stalin? Because he conquered Europe really easily, and he thought it was invincible, right? And that led to the destruction of the German army in the Soviet Union. So hubris is a factor. Then you have to look at internal political calculus, where even though America does not benefit from this war against Iran, Trump himself personally benefits. Why? Because the Saudis and the Israelis are bribing him to attack Iran. Remember that the Saudis invested $2 billion in the private equity fund of Jared Kushner, who is the son-in-law of Donald Trump. And the Israelis, through Miriam Adelson, have been financing Trump's political career, right? So Miriam Adelson, a few months back, said that she will put up $250 million if Trump were to run a third term. So Trump is getting a lot of financial and political support from the Saudis and the Israelis. Also remember that if this war goes sideways and Trump is forced to use ground troops, he will probably get approval from Congress, and this will give him emergency war powers, which will allow him to influence the midterms. So Trump is thinking about a third term, and I think at the ballot box, he probably won't get it. But if there's a war going on and you can delay elections and you have emergency war powers and people will rally around the flag, then he probably will get a third term. And the last factor that is very important is the eschatological factor, where if you look at the Epstein files, it's clear that we are run by secret societies. It's clear that the world is run by these individuals who have a lot of power. We don't know who they are, but they control the military, they control the national security apparatus. And these people, there are different names for these people. You can call them the Illuminati, and the Illuminati are composed of three major groups, okay? You have the Jesuits, who control the Vatican. You have the Septine Frankists, which control the modern state of Israel today. And you have the Freemasons, which control the national security apparatus of the United States. And they believe that Israel, this war in the Middle East, is key to the end times in creating heaven on earth. So it's almost like a script that they're following, even though it doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I would say that these are the best reasons why this is happening. So my first point is that the United States military is not designed to fight a 21st century war. Remember, the military-industrial complex came to being after World War II, and it was designed to fight the Cold War. And the Cold War was really about muscle flexing, about who was able to send people up into space, who was the first to get the person on the moon, who had the more complex missile systems. And so the entire American military strategy revolves around very sophisticated technology that costs a lot of money to build. And that's what the American air defense system is basically. And that's why we're seeing this asymmetry, as you point out, in this war, where you have these $1 million missiles trying to take out these $50,000 drones. And it's not sustainable in the long term. And so what we're seeing is really the puncturing of the aura of invincibility and invisibility that sustained American hegemony for the past 20 years, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And this is really a reordering of not just the global economy, because this signals the collapse of the petrodollar, and with it, the entire US dollar-based reserve currency system, but also the global hegemony of the United States. We're moving towards a multipolar world.
We were actually curious for your view on a disputed report here from the Washington Post. We can put it up here on the screen, F3. A push from the Saudis, Israel helped move Trump to attack Iran. Now, this has been internally disputed by Saudi Arabia, saying that they did not push the Trump administration to attack Iran. However, this is clearly an authorized leak from our own government, trying to at least lay some of the blame on behalf of the GCC. What do you make of this analysis and of this narrative that Saudi Arabia was also trying to be behind this push to bomb Iran?
So I've always argued that both Saudi Arabia and Israel are heavily invested in regime change in Iran. In fact, Saudi Arabia sees Iran as much more of an existential crisis than Israel. Because remember, Israel still has nuclear weapons, and Israel is a very diverse, very sophisticated economy, whereas Saudi Arabia is completely reliant on oil. And it's always had problems with Iran because Iran is a theocracy opposed to the Saudi monarchy. Iran funds and equips the Houthis, which have been antagonistic towards Saudi Arabia for the longest time. And right now, the Saudi economy is suffering. It's been trying to pivot towards more of a tourist economy. That's why they brought in Ronaldo. That's why they're switching to e-gaming. That's why they're building something called a line, NEOM. And all these things are not working out. So they need to be able to control the oil resources of the entire Middle East if they are to survive and thrive as a nation. So I do believe that this reporting is credible, even though it does make Saudi Arabia look bad. But remember, Saudi Arabia says that they wanted peace, but they are helping the Israelis and the Americans attack Iran right now because they're allowing the Israelis and Americans to use Saudi airspace. Everyone says that the worst calamity that could happen in the United States is if it were to send ground troops into Iran. At the same time, the United States are committed to regime change in Iran. We've never had a precedent in history where you were able to regime change from the air alone. You need ground troops. And so unfortunately, what's going to happen over the next few months is that pressure will build on America to send ground troops, especially from the GCC countries and from Israel, which are being pounded right now by the Iranians. So remember that if the GCC countries, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, Bahrain, if they go, then the petrodollar goes with them. So the Americans need to protect these countries, and these countries are going to demand that either the Americans bribe the Iranians to cease, and this is like $5 trillion in indemnity, okay? Or send ground troops to wipe out the Iranian threat once and for all. And I know that there's no political will for ground troops to be used against Iran among the American people. But remember that 78% of American people was against initial strikes against Iran in the first place.